Hey everybody, and welcome to episode number 5 of Weight Loss Awakening. I am so pleased with all the comments that we've received from the videos, and I am super excited that we're building a community of people over at the Facebook group. I wanted to thank everyone over there for their comments and their suggestions, and also for the amazing success stories that we're seeing over there. This video is entitled The 7 Reasons Why You Should Consider Decreasing Animal Protein Intake. It is essentially going to be the video that I'll probably refer people to in terms of talking about protein and thinking about protein. So we're going to jump into the 7 things, but before I do, I wanted to mention that I am not a vegan, and so anything that I say in this video is intended really just to speak to the science of the matter and not from any ethical perspective. I believe that there are ethical ways of eating animals, and but I also agree that we are generally in this society eating way too much animal protein, and we'll go through those 7 reasons why. But in the popular culture now, there are a lot of videos and movies and documentaries being made, like Forks Over Knives and What the Health and Cowspiracy. All of these are made by vegan groups, and so they are trying to further a certain agenda, which is veganism, and a lot of those people are doing it for reasons beyond science. They're doing it for promoting a vegan agenda, which is fine with me. If that's your belief system, then that's okay. I happen to believe that there are ethical ways that you can eat meat, and so I just wanted to lead this episode with discussing that, and so that you understand where I'm coming from, even though I tend to agree with a lot of the arguments made because we're relying on the science. But we'll go into more detail about all of these things as we go through the 7 reasons why you should consider reducing your animal protein intake. So number 1 is you have 3 macronutrients, right? You've got protein, you've got fat, and you've got carbohydrates. And when you increase the amount of protein, you're, by definition, decreasing the ratio of fat and carbohydrate. And when it comes to animal protein intake, we are used to eating a portion of animal protein in every single meal, but that is something that really has never been done in human history for the most part. Most communities around the world, and we'll talk about that in one of the other 7 points, never really ate meat in every meal. Meat is a luxury, and if we're increasing the amount of animal protein that we eat, that means we're getting less healthy fats and less healthy carbohydrates. And when you look at things on a perspective of looking at these 3 ratios, you certainly are much better served getting healthy fats and healthy carbohydrates than increasing levels of animal protein. And you'll get to understanding the reasons why that is as we go through the other steps. Number 2 is studies have shown that increasing the amount of animal protein actually increases your weight. Now, there may be lots of reasons for that, one of which could be that the meat that you're eating is loaded with antibiotics, and when they give the antibiotics to the animals, it actually causes them to gain weight. For whatever reason that may be. Maybe it's because it ruins the gut microbiome, and as a result of ruining the gut microbiome, we've seen in humans that can alter metabolism and increase weight gain. That's why people who are on chronic antibiotics can sometimes have weight control issues because of this damage to the gut microbiome. But in general terms, when you look at the studies, it seems to be that when you increase the amount of animal protein in your diet, there's actually an increase in weight. And one of those studies actually showed that that is regardless of accounting for the calories, which means that if you take, in this particular study that we're talking about, if you look at the calorie counts, people who are eating the same amount of calories but had a higher percentage, like I mentioned in the first point, had a higher percentage of animal protein to carbohydrates and fat, but yet the same calories still gained weight. So this is something to consider when we're thinking about reducing the amount of animal protein in your diet, because it can lead to weight loss if you reduce the amount of animal protein in your diet. Number three is it increases insulin resistance, which basically means, and this was shown in a study of Seventh-day Adventists, because before they did this study, basically they looked at all of these different communities and they showed that increased protein does lead to insulin resistance, but they weren't sure the difference between plant protein and animal protein. And so they studied Seventh-day Adventists, because they're mostly vegetarian, to see if there was any change in the insulin resistance depending on plant protein versus animal protein. And sure enough, what they found is that you're getting insulin resistance as a result of animal protein, but not plant protein. So number four is it increases insulin levels. Now, the interesting thing about increasing insulin levels is that we've always known that, for example, cheese raises insulin levels to a great deal, but we also know now that just animal protein in general raises insulin levels. And so what's the big deal about that? Well, we have to keep in mind that there is a connection between obesity, and there's a connection between obesity and diabetes and cancer. And it sort of looks like this. Your fat in your body is generally not just sitting there. It is active. It's a metabolically active part of your body, which means it releases chemicals, hormones, and when there's obesity happening, it's releasing something called cytokines, which is a type of inflammation in your body. And when you have inflammation in your body, it causes insulin resistance, which is what we just spoke of a second ago. Now, when you have insulin resistance, your body is trying to compensate because it's not getting the chemicals where it needs to go. And so it releases even more insulin. And you get this vicious cycle where your body has to continually try to produce insulin when there's this background level of inflammation that's causing some of the resistance. Well, we also know that when you have these elevated levels of insulin in your body, it's also associated with all kinds of different problems, especially cancer. So there are several cancers in the human body that have been shown to be linked to insulin increased levels, so high levels of insulin in the blood. Now, what makes this additionally troublesome is that a lot of people will counter with the fact that, well, this is just a consequence of eating sugar or making insulin levels going up for different factors, and it's not necessarily a consequence of the levels of insulin, but what's causing the insulin to go up. But now we know that what's happening is that insulin is also a growth factor. And when you have a growth factor like insulin, in addition to the inflammation of obesity, you're getting something that's setting up the system for cancer. But we also know that when you add insulin just to cell cultures, you actually get an oxidative damage to the DNA, which is something that can lead to damages of the DNA, which can lead to cancer. And they found that when you put a little bit of insulin on cells in cell culture, you get oxidative damage to the DNA, and that the DNA actually becomes more sensitive to the damaging effect, which means you need even less after that to cause the damage. So this is very troublesome, and so we need to keep in mind that when we eat meat, we're actually raising the insulin levels, which leads to this whole set of other factors that's very damaging. Number 5 is, generally speaking, meat is really raised in abominable conditions with disgusting pens and crowded animals. And we have to really think about that from a, I guess you could say, almost a karmic perspective, that if we want to really be involved in eating meat, we need to find out clean sources of meat. Now, people on the vegan side are going to, who are into it for ethical reasons, are basically going to say that there is no way that you can eat meat from an ethical perspective. I believe that there are people who are farms that raise animals humanely and kill them humanely and don't raise them with antibiotics, and they let them graze on the land and they give them a good life. And so I believe that's very possible. And that's what you should be searching out. The fact that meat is so cheap is really not the way it should be. The reason it's cheap is because the government gives subsidies for corn and soybean and all these things that they feed the cattle, and that lowers the price of the meat. But if you want high quality meat, you have to buy high quality meat, and that's going to be expensive. So that's something to keep in mind. Number 6 is long-lived populations around the world don't eat a lot of meat. So let's look at that for a second. There was a great book called The Blue Zones that was written by Dan Buettner. It's a book that I highly recommend. And in that book, he basically looked at the long-lived populations around the world, and most of them ate a plant-based diet with very little bits of meat. Number 7 is mortality rates increase with meat consumption. Now, I know probably people out there who may be on a paleo diet, who might be eating a lot of protein, must be saying at this point, well, if you're eating clean meat and you're doing everything else right, that's probably not the case. And you know what? You may be right. But the studies are fairly clear when you look at the general population eating a general diet, that the more meat consumption that you eat, the more of a mortality rate, the higher the death rate that people have. And, you know, it's true that if you are really doing everything cleanly, then maybe, you know, if you're eating high quality vegetables and you're only eating clean, you know, clean sourced meat, you know, grass fed and humanely raised, then maybe it's okay. But I think if you are eating meat all the time at every meal, there's really no historical precedent, generally speaking, to that. And so one should rethink the fact, especially given all these other things that we discussed regarding insulin levels and all the other issues we discussed in this video, that reducing the level of meat is probably a good idea. Well, that's usually countered with, well, I need to get my protein. So you don't actually need a lot of protein. Protein requirements are not all that great. And if you're eating a large quantity of greens, which I recommend 1 pound of greens per day, and you're getting some properly cooked beans, you're going to get enough protein. If you want to have, you know, a small, like, size of a deck of cards piece of meat once a day or once every other day, that probably would be okay as well. But more than that is probably too much. If you feel like you need to have a little bit of meat, then that's fine. Get it sourced from a very clean source. And if you've gone several days without it and you just feel like you need it, don't worry about protein malnutrition. I mean, that is something that I don't think anyone really sees in the United States. First of all, we're already over-consuming things, but if you cut back and you're eating a high-quality vegetables, it's really not a big deal. Now, I wanted to comment on something I saw yesterday on the internet. It's a conversation between a body hacking authority and a very popular doctor. And they were commenting that there are no thriving vegans that they've ever met. And I'd like to just say that, again, everyone knows who's watching this video that I'm not a vegan. But I know many vegans, and I've always given my patients the option of doing things on a vegan diet or a non-vegan diet. As long as they get that 1 pound of greens in per day and they reduce the amount of protein consumption, we've been able to reverse autoimmune diseases with astonishing success, and of course, weight loss. So I give people the option. And what bothered me about this conversation was this statement that there are no healthy vegans out there. The fact is the opposite. There are thriving vegans out there. That generally speaking, the body habitus of vegans, generally speaking, I know there are bodybuilder vegans out there, and there's a football player now that's vegan. But generally speaking, vegans are much skinnier than the general population. But that doesn't mean that they're not thriving. If your ideal of health is to look like a CrossFit or a bodybuilder, if that's your ideal of health, then everyone who doesn't look that way is going to look like they're not thriving. But it's not the case. You don't necessarily have to be cut and chiseled and muscle bound to be thriving. And I think the conception of health that we all have has been conditioned by people out there who act as health authorities to say that there's a certain way that someone who is healthy should look. And that's just not the case. There are lots of ways of looking healthy out there because it's not necessarily 100% reflection on the outside. In addition to the fact that, as we discuss in Weight Loss Awakening, there are 4 pillars of health: nutrition, mental state, environmental influences, and movement and mechanics. And all of these contribute to an overall state of health and wellness. And when you exclude one, you are ignoring something that could potentially be the major determining factor in your health, your weight, whether or not you thrive or feel ebullient and full of energy and a loving life and having the ability to do the things that you want to do. All of these things are not just a consequence of nutrition. And of course, as you know, as we get into the further lessons, we'll be talking about these other pillars of health. And I wanted to say that I wanted to thank everyone for the comments and the suggestions, because some of these videos are in consequence to comments that are made in the Facebook group. If you're watching this on YouTube, click the like button and subscribe, but also note that there'll be a link to the Facebook group. If you want to join our supportive group of people, that would be awesome. And I would just again like to say that we're building a community and your comments are very important. So please leave them below. And I look forward to seeing you next time on Weight Loss Awakening. This is Dr. Karp.